London did not forgive, it curated. It arranged misfortune beneath chandeliers, framed it in gilt, and invited its friends to look. The night Lady Clara Beaumont, Duchess of Windermere, walked into Lady Etheridge's musicale uninvited, the city's appetite sharpened its knives and called them compliments. Candles multiplied themselves against mirrors. 100 faces gleamed like coins before the sermon. A violin rehearsed sympathy it would not spend. And then Clara appeared, late, unannounced, wearing a gown the exact colour of moonlight that has learned restraint. No one bowed. That would have been kindness, and kindness spoils a show. Fans whispered. Pearls tried not to rattle. A matron dropped a lorgnette as if justice had grown heavy. The Duchess stood just inside the threshold and permitted the room to make its inventory, a figure more slender than scandal had reported, shoulders carried like a difficult book, properly read, eyes the grey of honest weather. Her hair was simple, pinned without apology. She wore no diamonds. Diamonds had defected last winter, sold in silence to pay debts not hers. On her wrist, a thin bracelet of black enamel, mourning without theatre. Windermere, someone breathed, and the name arrived like the cold. It had been a year since the old Duke died and left London a riddle it preferred to solve with gossip rather than arithmetic. He had been cruel in the efficient way of men who think their vices a profession, cards in rooms that smelled of men outlasting mornings, loans transmuted by signatures into nightmares, laudanum poured by the ounce into evenings that desired no witnesses. He died with God as unconsulted as his steward, in a bed not meant for sleep, and the city discovered it loved pity almost as much as disgrace. He left behind a ledger ashamed of its own ink, an estate that mistook grandeur for solvency, and a wife whose innocence was cheaper to doubt than prove. She must have known, London said, the way cowards prefer to speak when safety is assured. She drove him to it. She sold heirlooms to buy silence. She poisoned him with her beauty, or with nothing at all. Some women kill by being better than the men who fail them. The coroner said otherwise. Coroner's reports do not attend balls. Invitations, which are the city's currency for belief, ceased to arrive. Windermere House shuttered half its windows and discovered a new species of draught. Clara withdrew to Devon for a season and learned how rain can keep counsel better than friends. If she had possessed less pride, she might have begged rehabilitation from those who practice it as a hobby. If she had possessed more rage, she might have broken a window and called it weather. Instead, she chose the much harder sport of dignity. She balanced accounts. She dismissed liveried incompetence and hired competent poverty. She visited tenants with blankets and a grammar of mercy. She sold jewels her mother had called daughters and paid a footman's, father's debts with coin that had once slept around her throat. She did not speak of love. She had married a duke and discovered the species can be counted without arithmetic involving the heart. But dignity does not feed rumour, it starves it into invention. And so, when the harvest was gathered, and the sea forgot for one afternoon that it is merely a disciplined hysteria, Clara returned to London, not to beg, but to look it in the eye. She had slept the previous night at a quiet lodging-house off Hanover Square, where the landlady never asked questions except the useful kind. Tea or chocolate? Candles at 9? Shall I sit up for you? In the morning, Clara wrote 2 letters, one to her steward about the mill stream, which had opinions, one to the trustees regarding an apprenticeship for a clever boy whose father was trying to outrun gin. She dressed herself the way a soldier buckles on resolve, tucked the last of her mother's handkerchiefs into a pocket, as if it were a charm against implausible kindness, and stepped back into the theatre. Lady Etheridge's footman hesitated when she gave her name, because men of his station are occasionally made to hold the world's manners in their hands. Clara spared him the trouble. "I shall find my own way," she said gently, and did. At the edge of the musicale she paused long enough to let the room choose its weapons. It selected pity first. Pity is fashionable and costs nothing. A countess whispered that grief did not suit her complexion. A viscountess murmured that some women were built for tragedy in the way some are built for lace. A man near the punch said the word opium with relish, as if it were a rare fruit he had picked and wished to share. Clara inclined her head to no one in particular and moved forward as a tide does when it has decided upon an inconvenient shore. She found a place beside a pillar that had seen centuries attempt to be elegant and watched the violinist make emotions obedient. She did not tremble. She did not search the doorway for rescue disguised as masculine attention. The room had expected ruins, it found architecture. That was when Nathaniel Harcourt, newly Duke of Evermere, saw her. He had not meant to attend. Politics found him tedious when it wore silk instead of debate. But duty had wrists and dragged. He stood half-hidden behind a garrulous earl who preferred history as a means of self-flattery, and let his attention wander the way men's attention does when it is looking for honesty and prepared not to find it. He saw first the moon-coloured gown, then the refusal to apologize, then the face London had taught him to despise. His education failed him at once. He did not look away. Their eyes met, because eyes sometimes decide before their owners do. Clara felt, with the precise astonishment of a clock striking an unexpected hour, that this stranger's gaze held no triumph in it, no salvation either, only recognition, the kind one gives a mirror that does not distort. She looked back exactly long enough to acknowledge the courtesy, and then returned to the violin as if the world had learned its manners. Across the room, whispers noticed. Whispers are professional. The piece ended. The applause did its work, brisk and guiltless. Lady Etheridge's daughter, who sang as though vowels were pearls that might chip, prepared a bravura aria to remind the room that suffering is best when it rhymes. In the breathing space before the first note, Nathaniel stepped into the aisle and made the sort of error that becomes a legend. He bowed to Clara Beaumont, low, correct, unhurried, and extended his hand as if to a queen denied a throne and no longer in the mood to accept substitutes. Gasps are vulgar. London prefers them anyway. Someone tittered, someone else dropped a programme and let it be proof. Clara considered the offered hand for a heartbeat in which a life can change careers. She knew the arithmetic. A waltz granted in public would cost him reputation and her more rumour. A refusal would permit the room to keep its narrative that she had been exiled by propriety and should keep to geography. She raised her chin, the small, fatal distance that separates polite girls from women who have read themselves in private, and placed her hand in his. They did not dance. Lady Etheridge's daughter had begun to sing, and even scandal knows when to sit down. But the room had seen the bow, the room had seen her accept it. The room would tell the story with embroidery and sell tickets twice. Nathaniel stepped closer, not indecently, simply enough that his voice could cross the short distance between two people without asking society to carry it. "Your Grace," he said, and something in the way he used the title polished it back to its original meaning. "Evermere," Clara returned, precise as a mathematician. "Forgive me," he said softly, "for seeing you." "Most people do not apologize for eyesight," she murmured. "They ought," he replied. "It is frequently misused." The aria soared, a prayer composed by a man who had never met hunger. Clara's mouth almost smiled. "You are very young to be unfashionable." "I am very tired to be young," he said, and for a moment she almost believed him. A dowager nearby began to breathe as if smothered by virtue. Nathaniel straightened, the bow completed, the hand restored to hers. He did not press for conversation. He did not annex her corner of the world. He retreated one measured pace as if to tell the room that courtesy need not be a seduction to be brave. Then, because London was watching and had paid handsomely for the seat, he returned to his place as if nothing consequential had occurred. Only the violinist, who missed a note and then punished the next one into submission, betrayed that anything had. When the musicale ended, invitations, which had earlier fled Clara as if she carried plague in a muff, began sidling back in pairs and trios. A Marquis's wife admired her restraint. A baron's daughter asked who cut her gown. An ambitious duke's mother, who kept a ledger of favours like a bank, sent a note not of condolence but of curiosity. Clara tucked each card into her glove as one stores evidence for a future trial. She took no triumph. Triumph is noisy and attracts creditors. Outside, the January air remembered its profession and taught cheeks to sting. Clara's hired carriage waited with the modesty of things paid for in cash. As she stepped in, a shadow detached itself from a doorway and stood, revealed. Evermere again, bareheaded, snow beginning to reconsider itself along his hair. He did not speak at first. Men who think best do not interrupt the cold. "At tomorrow's levee," he said at last, "I will be told 100 times that I have made an error of taste. I thought I would warn you. I intend to make it again." She looked at him, at the young man whose eyes had the old look of someone already acquainted with the price of people. "Your Grace," she said, "errors of taste seldom survive a second repetition. They become character." "Then perhaps," he answered, almost smiling, "I am improving mine." A footman closed the door, sparing London any further education for the evening. The carriage moved. Clara leaned back and let the city pass like a rumour losing its nerve. She did not touch the pocket where the last of her mother's handkerchiefs slept. She did not touch the bracelet that kept time with another woman's grief. She closed her eyes briefly and said to the part of herself that had grown used to being misplaced, "Attend." The world had looked at her and, for one brief, improbable hour, had not decided on her behalf. She could not trust it to continue, but she could begin. Behind her, in the bright, breathless air, the young Duke of Evermere stood still until the snow remembered to fall properly. Then he put on his hat, which was less courage than accuracy, and walked away into a city that had just acquired a new story and did not yet understand its grammar. The morning papers did what mornings do best in London. They pretended to deliver truth and succeeded at delivering appetite. Columns wrung their hands with excellent punctuation. Evermere bows to Winmere's widow. A waltz refused, scandal accepted. An anonymous wit whose bravery had been improved by anonymity wrote that pity was the new fashion and predicted shortages by Thursday. Nathaniel Harcourt read none of it. He read maps instead, estate lines that ran like old scars along Devon's coast, and a brief letter from his steward suggesting that Winmere's western tenant farms touched Evermere lands at 2 hedgerows and a quarrelsome brook. The letter proposed drainage. Nathaniel proposed honesty. He sent a note requesting the Duchess's time on a matter of boundaries and made certain it carried no perfume but urgency. The carriage took him out of London and into a countryside that still believed in weather. Frost had frosted again. Fields held their breath. The hedges wore lace precisely where lace has sense to be worn. Windermere Hall rose from a ridge like a lesson in what money does when it forgets about kindness. porticos too proud for their columns, windows designed to display opinions instead of light. Yet, as he drew near, he saw evidence of a different owner, the drive cleared with the logic of someone who respects hooves, not marble, smoke rising in honest verticals from chimneys recently reconciled, a kitchen garden plotting spring with the industry of women who do not ask seasons for permission. He was announced without embroidery. The butler, a man whose dignity had survived several regimes, offered a bow calibrated for a duke who might not deserve it. "Her Grace will receive you in the morning room," he said, and did not ask whether London had sent him for entertainment. The morning room proved to be an afternoon room in the making. Pale walls, sunlight with a conscience, a vase of winter branches that had learned how to be decorative without leaves. Clara rose as Nathaniel entered, and made courtesy not to his title, but to the fact of a guest. "Your Grace," she said, the syllables in their proper places. "Your Grace," he returned, and felt the title do its old work properly, a recognition of stewardship, not a password to regard. He explained the drainage, the hedges, the brook, that believed strongly in changing its mind. She listened, as if land could be persuaded by rhetoric. "The tenant at Lower Stoke," she said, "refuses to admit that water is not a tenant's friend. He thinks ditches an insult to Providence. If you present me as a villain, he will be persuaded at once." "I had hoped to be useful," Nathaniel said. "Then be a villain when asked," Clara replied, almost smiling. "It rescues gentlemen from making speeches." He allowed himself a laugh, brief and grateful. The room accepted it. They discussed boundaries like people who have learned that geography is a form of ethics. When the business was finished, silence presented itself, not the brittle kind that begs for rescue, but the good sort that tests whether two lives can breathe in the same paragraph. "You caused a sensation last night?" she said at last, "as one mentions weather to a sailor." "I failed to look away," he answered. "London hates failures it cannot fix." "You will be punished," she warned. "I have been punished for less," he said. "I should prefer my punishments to be deserved." The butler arrived with tea and a tact that functioned as a chaperone. Porcelain practiced its small theatre. Steam rehearsed consolation. Nathaniel declined sugar. Clara did not. "It is a vulgar indulgence," she said, adding a second spoon, "and very good for the soul." "Then I shall sin more often," he said, and discovered that flirtation, when conducted as precision rather than sport, does not embarrass the speaker. He rose to go. Propriety demands exits long before hearts do, and then remembered London's appetite. "There is to be an assembly at Almack's on Thursday," he said carefully. "If you intend to attend, and I do not say you should, I will stand opposite you at the floor. I will not bow. I will not request a dance. I will do nothing but be seen seeing you. It is safer than last night. It is also worse." "Because they will pretend not to watch?" she asked. "Because they will watch and pretend to be bored," he said, "which is the ton's most dangerous climate." She looked at him then as people look at maps when they are not sure whether the road sketched in ink is a promise or a dare. "Very well," she said, "come and be bored." He bowed. The butler escorted him to the door with the charity of men who have learned to pity youth without insulting it. Outside, the afternoon had admitted to being evening. Nathaniel breathed air that had not been owned by anyone, and felt, with a clarity that might have been foolishness, that he had already pledged himself to a principle larger than prudence, to see a woman whole in a city that preferred its women conveniently broken. Almack's was cruelty dressed as regulation. Tickets were rationed by dowagers who suspected God of indulgence. The music obeyed rations. The lemonade obeyed scripture. The ton came to be forgiven for its virtues. Clara entered, shielded by nothing but competence. She wore dove grey that refused to be tragic, and pearls so modest they read as defiance. Heads turned, then pretended to turn back. Nathaniel stood where he had promised, opposite the floor, hands behind his back, the posture of a man observing a military review in which the troops were opinions. He neither bowed nor beckoned. He only watched. Clara ignored him with exquisite accuracy. This too the room noticed. That indifference could be choreography. A young duke of excellent lineage and poor imagination crossed to Clara with a smile like lacquer. "Your Grace," he drawled, "may I request the honour?" "You may request it," she said, "and I may decline without malice." She inclined her head the width of good breeding. The lacquer cracked. An earl's heir, fresh from the discovery that debts behave better when paid by fathers, tried again with a compliment about her gown. "It is the colour," he said, "of a secret." "It is the colour of weather," she corrected, "and therefore honest." By the third refusal, the room's pity had begun to molt into interest. Pity is cheap, interest demands investment. Two matrons revised their opinions. A widow reconsidered her son. The patronesses at the door counted Clara's refusals like coins. During the country dance, Nathaniel's mother approached him armed with tradition and a fan that had ruined men. "You will stop," she murmured, not moving her lips. "I have only stood still," he said. "You will stop that," she replied. "Stillness is more inflammatory than spectacle." "Mother," he said, "I am attempting character." "Character," she answered, "is merely habit viewed in candlelight. Choose a different one." He bowed to the argument without accepting its conclusions. When she glided away, he looked across the room and found Clara speaking to no one and to the entire city. Her composure was not armour, it was an invitation to accuracy. He loved her then, not with flowers and vows, but with a recognition that felt like honesty finally receiving its wages. As he turned, a figure intercepted him. Lord Fleet, a man whose coat had opinions about Paris and whose debts had opinions about Fleet. "A word, Evermere," he said, the tone of a creditor collecting respect. "You are making the rest of us appear unkind." "You require no assistance?" Nathaniel said pleasantly. Fleet leaned nearer, breath wine-sour. "Be careful. Pity becomes a pastime and then a dependency." "On whose part?" Nathaniel asked. "On hers," Fleet said, and smiled like a knife. Nathaniel smiled back like a surgeon. "Then let us hope she acquires better company." He returned to his post and kept it. When the last dance had been declared and the last hypocrisy folded into cloaks, Clara crossed the room as if it were an ocean she would not let drown her. She stopped at the edge of his shadow and allowed it to touch her. "You were very dull this evening," she said. "I have rarely worked harder," he replied. She almost laughed. "Why?" "Because I prefer to be useful," he said. "And dullness, properly applied, can be a shield." "For me," she said, and the words needed neither question nor gratitude. "And for you?" "For me," he agreed, "because if I danced with you now, I should discover I have run out of reasons not to do it again forever." The fan in her hand stilled. The room, though dispersing, contrived to listen. "You should not say that," she murmured. "I should not," he agreed. "I should say nothing, and I have said it very well all evening." She looked past him to the door, to the street, to the carriage that would bring her back to the lodging-house where privacy tasted like thrift. "Devonshire is full of boundaries," she said lightly. "We must attend to them before spring." "Send for me," he answered, "and I will come as a villain." "Bring boots," she said. "The brook misbehaves." "Then we are colleagues," he said, and her mouth softened at the word. He bowed, not low, not theatrical, simply accurate, and let her go. Outside, snow argued briefly with rain and lost. Inside, London adjusted its ledgers. Pity was down, desire, though it would swear otherwise, had begun to buy. Nathaniel returned home and found his desk where he had left it, and his certainty where he had not. He sat, took up a pen, and began a letter to a steward about ditches that were not ditches at all, but roads that might lead 2 lives toward the same sea. When he sealed it, he realized his hands were steadier than they had been in months. It is a vulgar truth, and therefore useful. Purpose is the one intoxicant with no hangover. At Windermere that night, Clara untied her pearls, laid them in a small wooden tray her maid had sanded with affection, and stood a moment before the looking-glass. "Attend," she told the woman in the glass again, but the voice was different now, less command, more invitation. In the firelight she wrote a note to the bailiff about lime for the dairy yard, another to a widow about her boy's apprenticeship, and, after a long pause, one line on a piece of paper she did not intend to send. He did not look away. She folded it, tucked it beside the handkerchief, and blew out the candle. The room went dark obediently. Somewhere in the city, an orchestra packed its instruments. Somewhere in the country, a brook rehearsed a mischief that would require boots. Between them, a woman and a man practiced a new form of scandal, the careful, unremarkable bravery of 2 people preparing to be seen as human. Devonshire decided on weather the way juries decide on men, suddenly, unanimously, and with a taste for spectacle. Nathaniel came to Windermere to argue with a brook, and found himself trapped by a sky conducting its own trial. It began with honest rain, then thickened to a curtain. By dusk, the wind had learned Latin and was declaiming at the eaves. A groom brought in the last horse. The housekeeper set bowls of salt by the thresholds as if superstition were sandbags. The butler delivered the verdict with ceremonial regret. "Your Grace, the road is flooded. We must impose upon your patience overnight." Nathaniel, who had intended only an hour, said he was at the house's mercy and meant it. Windermere Hall did not flirt with guests, it appraised them. Yet that night the rooms felt warmed by stubborn fires and the busy kindness of people who understood that weather is an employer. Shadows behaved, stair-treads remembered their manners. Nathaniel changed into a dry coat and stood a moment at a window where rain braided itself against the glass, ropes thrown by a sea that had wandered inland. He told himself he was thinking of hedgerows. He was thinking of her. Clara received him in the small west parlour, the one that kept company with the kitchen's useful heat. No gilded torment of chairs here. Only a long table, friendly to elbows, a faded rug, honest as a confession, and shelves of books that had earned their dust. She had exchanged dove grey for a darker blue that made the lamplight behave respectfully. Her hair, unadorned, was coiled like a line of neat handwriting. On the table lay maps, a ledger, and, like a host keeping a hand at a guest's back, 2 cups of chocolate, sending up faint prayers of steam. "You are marooned," she said, the corners of her mouth consenting to humour. "I prefer stationed," he replied. "It makes me sound useful." "Then be useful," she said, sliding him a map. "The tenants at Lorden Bottom have accused the brook of slander. I propose a ditch and an apology." They bent over paper like co-conspirators drafting a better country. He forgot to be careful. She forgot to be alone. For an hour, they discussed land the way some people discuss love, its moods, its needs, its insistence on being seen whole. When the practical ran out, silence arrived, not as a curtain, but as a chair pulled close. "Shall I stoke the fire?" he asked. It stokes itself when attended, she said, and then, after a breath that sounded like courage sorting its papers, she added, "There are things you should know, not to solicit pity, to revise the record." He did not move. Men who have learned to command learn slowly how to receive. "I am listening." "Winmere was not always unkind," she began, eyes on the flames as if memory preferred mediation. "He could be charming in the way storms are charming a mile away. Colour, drama, the promise of narrative. I mistook spectacle for weather. By the time I learned the difference, I had married it." She spoke without embroidery. Cards first, how they were played not for pleasure but for certainty that could be mortgaged. Then debts, how they multiplied like rumour and ate silver as calmly as bread. Then opium, how it turned evenings to fog and left mornings stripped of verbs. She did not spare herself. She catalogued her own futilities, the half-truths she wrote to his creditors, the dinners she hosted with a smile taught by necessity, the jewels marched quietly into the hands of a discreet dealer who preferred not to know stories. "When he died," she said at last, "the wickedness was so ordinary that the city invented better. It preferred a wife who poisoned her husband to a world in which men drown on dry land." The rain answered with a long hand on the window. Nathaniel kept still until stillness became an act of service. "Was there no one to stand between you and the invention?" "My steward, a maid, a vicar who preferred soup to sermons," she said. "But no one the city found believable." "And you?" he asked softly. "Do you still find yourself believable?" She looked at him then. It was not a dramatic glance. It was a slow turning as if a room had changed its geography, and she wished to register it. "Most days," she said. "On others, I borrow the belief of people who have earned mine." He felt something in him take an oath, not public, anatomical. "Then borrow mine," he said. "I keep it in surplus." A smile, the smallest, the most expensive, threatened and survived. "Do you always practice economics at midnight?" "Only when the market is honest," he said, and the lamp caught his grin as if to vouch for it. She poured more chocolate. The simple choreography of cups and saucers gave their hearts time to recover from truth. Then she asked a question that changed the angle of the night. "Why did you not look away? At the musicale?" "Because the room asked me to," he said. "And because I have been cowardly often enough to recognize the smell. I thought if I declined once, I might teach myself a habit." "Character," she murmured, thinking of his mother at Almack's. "A habit viewed in candlelight." "Exactly," he said, and discovered how quickly two people can become a chorus. The storm settled into its long argument with the roof. The fire made agreements with the logs one by one. Their talk wandered into odd corners, childhood illnesses, favourite lines of verse, whether mercy begins with charity or with accuracy. She confessed a fondness for the Psalms, for the way they complain in complete sentences. He admitted to loving maps because they pretend chaos can be ordered into courtesy. He told her he had once wanted to be a barrister and failed, respectably, at Latin. She confessed to praying in the dairy because cream listens. They laughed and grew quiet, and, as often happens when two people have earned the right to unbutton a silence, fell into something like peace. Lightning briefly photographed the room. Thunder signed the portrait. Nathaniel stood and crossed to the shelves. "May I?" he asked. "Choose something unfashionable," she said. He reached for a slim, bruised book. Cowper, who sings gently to people who have learned to flinch. He read a stanza, careful not to perform, and paused at a line that sounded like a key. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He glanced up. She had closed her eyes, not in piety but in rest, one step short of sleep. "Continue," she said. He did. When the poem ended, he let quiet cover it like a blanket. "Clara," he said, tasting her name in private for the first time. "Yes," she answered, eyes still closed. "You are not what they say." "I know," she said, the two words both fragile and infuriatingly brave. He returned the book and, without planning the audacity, drew his chair nearer the hearth, nearer her. The lamps lowered themselves, as lamps will when they are permitted to be conspirators. He did not reach for her hand. He let his presence make a small, steady argument against abandonment. Outside, the rain relented, not out of pity, but from exhaustion. Inside, something more patient than weather took its seat between them. When housemaids rose before dawn to coax ashes into morning, they found the west parlour tidied, the cups aligned, the book restored to its shelf. The fire had gone out in perfect order. On the table lay the map with 2 inked lines, one a ditch to persuade the brook, the other a path from the parlour door to the chair where she had sat, drawn in a different hand. Clara saw it later and almost laughed. He had left directions to return. At breakfast, the butler reported that the road had remembered how to be a road. Nathaniel stood at the threshold as the household bent itself back into day. He hesitated the way men do who understand that leaving is easy and departure is not. Clara came to him with the cool composure of a woman who will not bribe fate with softness. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he asked. "For believing me at the exact hour it mattered," she said. "And for bringing boots." "I will bring them again," he answered. "Then do," she said. "The brook misbehaves in all seasons." They looked at one another with the exactness of people who have ceased to be entertainment and become a task worth doing. He bowed, she did not curtsy. Respect had already been exchanged. He left into a morning washed blunt by weather. When his carriage turned, at the drive's end, she stood at the window and watched a dark line become a shadow, become a rumour, become the inevitable test of patience. On his seat, Nathaniel found a square of paper weighted with a small stone. The tenant at Lowestoke will accept a villain after Sunday. Beneath it, in a different ink, "You read well. Come as often as the weather requires." He smiled into the cold and did not correct the arithmetic. He would come as often as truth allowed. By noon, the sky had remembered blue. The fields steamed. Windermere breathed like a chest released from stays. In London, the story began to change tense. Pity, always hungry, found itself fed, briefly satisfied, then restless. Desire, which pretends to arrive last, took up a seat and ordered wine. And in a west parlour washed in winter light, a woman who had once been curated as ruin, and a man learning the grammar of courage, rewrote a reputation with nothing but patience, maps, and the sound of a voice not asked to defend itself. Spring, being vain, arrived early in London and demanded witnesses. Magnolia flung its sleeves over squares. Modesties placed commandments in windows. Parliament rehearsed righteousness. The city, having toyed all winter with pity like a bored cat, discovered a new amusement: curiosity. Evermere and Windermere ride the same weather. Devon lanes teach dukes strange manners. It was the sort of gossip that did not yet know whether to be cruel, which meant it would soon choose cruelty out of habit. Nathaniel returned first, duty in his pocket, rain still arguing with his boots. His mother greeted him with the cool affection of a woman who has nursed an heir and several grudges. "You have taken up agriculture and rebellion," she said. "Which is cheaper?" "Rebellion," he replied. Seed is dearer than principle. Then sow prudence, she advised, and sent him to Westminster to learn that men can be eloquent for hours without saying anything that would trouble a conscience. He sent for Clara a week later, not a summons, he did not command her, but a letter with sense in it, the drainage bill requiring her evidence, the boundary dispute wanting her maps, the orphan house at St. Bride's seeking a patron who was not a portrait. Come as a landowner, the letter said between its lines. Come as yourself. She read it at Windmere with a hand on the window latch, as if testing the weather for honesty. Devonshire had fitted itself around her grief like a kind garment. London remained a dress that pinched. Yet the idea of refusing him for the sake of fear sounded like a language she no longer spoke. Pack, she told her maid, grey, blue and armour. The maid set out silken common sense. Windmere's London house had been reopened at modest scale, enough staff to keep dignity from spoiling, not enough to inspire sin. Clara entered it the way one re-enters a church after scandal, with a chin that knows how to carry its own weight, and a heart instructed not to faint. Within an hour of the first lamp being lit, the invitations arrived breathless and contrite. The patronesses at Almack's remembered that mercy improves the complexion. A marchioness with a charitable committee remembered that Clara's name looked well on paper. An ambitious dowager remembered everything that could be traded for proximity to a story. Nathaniel came at dusk, not for ceremony, he had none left, but for the relief of seeing truth in the doorway. He bowed, and the bow told her the city had not edited him. "You look like weather I prefer to believe," he said, which was foolish and therefore accurate. "And you look like a man who has remembered sleep," she said, which was merciful and therefore true. They did not touch, they advanced logistics. She would testify before a committee about the river's behaviour. He would escort her to the church at St. Bride's to inspect cracked rafters and cracked accounts. They spoke like colleagues, with a conspiracy of tenderness they refused to name. The footmen, who were old enough to have learned discretion, pretended to be deaf with professional pride. London, discovering it had been deprived of spectacle for several minutes, redressed the balance at Lady Dalrymple's ball. Chandeliers confessed their crimes. A cotillion braided itself like good manners. Clara entered in lavender that refused apology. She had chosen pearls again. Pearls have a memory for sorrow and behave accordingly. When Nathaniel crossed the room to greet her, conversation hastened to get out of their way, and then pretended it had not. "Shall we repeat our triumph?" he murmured. "Which one?" she returned. "The one where we declined to dance and teach the room new arithmetic," he said. They performed indifference with such exact sympathy that admiration stumbled into desire by accident. Men who had pitied Clara suddenly wished to be forgiven by her. A duke with a jaw like a verdict asked to call. An earl with a library like a bribe invited her to select a volume. A viscount observed that charity sat nobly on some women, by which he meant himself. Clara smiled, declined, and continued, breathing. Nathaniel, who had prepared for hostility, found himself learning jealousy instead. Its narrow mouth, its eager arithmetic, the way it counts other men's glances like debts. His mother saw it and raised an eyebrow that had cancelled engagements. "You are behaving like a poet," she told him behind her fan. "The symptoms are unattractive at close range." He laughed thinly. "I shall prescribe myself labour." "Prescribe yourself courage," she said. "Labour without it is merely noise." Courage would be needed sooner than either wished. 3 days later the letter appeared, anonymous in appearance, confident in aim, passed along a chain of delicate hands until it landed, with immaculate timing, in Lady Dalrymple's morning circle, and from there, as inevitable as morning itself, at Evermere House. It alleged to be written by the late Duke of Windermere. It alleged many things men like to allege when they are safely dead. That Clara had bled him of coin, that she had bartered favours for silence, that she had been a partner in debauchery and a tyrant in thrift. The signature was bold. The paper smelled faintly of theatre. Nathaniel read it once without moving his face, then again slower, as if the ink might repent. He knew forgery when it shouted. He also knew London when it purred. Outside, carriages committed small crimes. Inside, he felt the old cowardice return, wearing a new coat. Duty, that respectable thief. If I defend her publicly and the letter proves genuine, I damage the bill, the cause, the people who need roofs more than romance. If I hesitate, I damage her. Hesitation, that oily politician, won the first vote. He took the letter to Clara with the worst courage of all, the kind that hopes the victim will make the decision for you. She read it, and did not flinch until the last line, where sentiment attempted handwriting. Then she folded the paper and set it aside, as one sets down an insect without breaking it. "It is forgery," she said calmly. "The hand is wrong, the malice too articulate." She met his eye. "It will be believed." "Only by those who prefer to," he said, too quickly. "Which is the city?" she answered, and almost smiled. "Do you intend to defend me, Nathaniel?" He opened his mouth and found words that were not worthy of the job. "If we wait a day, my solicitor can—" "Ah," she said softly. "Wait." "It is not fear," he lied poorly. "It is strategy." She looked past him to the window where London rehearsed its traffic. "I have stood in front of strategy before. It breaks nothing and mends nothing." She drew breath with the precision of a woman budgeting air. "You owe me nothing, but understand me clearly. Your silence will be taken for permission by men who have wanted it since I first failed to flatter them." "Clara," he began, and the name in his mouth sounded suddenly like a theft. She stood. It was not theatrical. It was tidy. "I have court at 2, she said. "I will speak of rivers, you will speak of drainage, the city will speak of me. Afterward I shall go home." "To Windermere?" he asked, meaning to safety, and discovering the question insulted both of them. "To myself," she said. At the committee she was flawless, maps precise, nouns obedient, the truth looking almost fashionable. Nathaniel, sitting 2 chairs away, praised her evidence and avoided her eyes. He saw how men who had never carried buckets nodded along as if they had invented rain. He saw the forged letter travel through the chamber like a cologne. He said nothing that would cost him votes he might spend later on a roof for strangers. He spent, instead, what was not his, her belief. By dusk, the city had done its work. The letter had become a rumour, had become a verdict. Women who had bowed to Clara in the morning discovered their husbands disliked it by evening. Invitations disappeared as deftly as they had arrived. A boy chalked poisoner on a wall and ran. Nathaniel sent for his solicitor. The man sent back paragraphs. None of them were sentences a heart could live on. At dawn, the housemaids found Windermere House as neat as a dismissal. Clara had left before the milk, taking with her the maid, 2 trunks, the ledger, and the pears that would otherwise have gone soft. On the blotter in the small writing room she had left a note, unsealed, unresentful. "The rafters at St. Bride's want bracing. Lime the north wall. Pay the joiner what he asks. He will do it properly. See beneath, smaller. You did not look away until the city asked you to. I cannot afford men who obey it more than they believe me." He read it standing. He did not sit for a long time. His mother, entering without ceremony because motherhood prefers accuracy to etiquette, found him with the note in his hand and a face he had not practiced. She took it, read, and said the one sentence women keep for sons who have finally earned correction. "Well, now do the brave thing at the wrong hour." He looked up, uncomprehending. "Go to Devon," she said. "You may arrive too late for explanation, arrive for confession. The city pays in applause. The country insists on truth. Choose your creditor." Rain, which had chosen spring as its profession, began again at the window. Nathaniel folded the note once, twice, not for neatness, but to keep it from being the largest thing in the room. "Have the horses," he said, "and the map." "What map?" his mother asked, already ringing for boots. "The one to Windermere," he answered, "and the one to my own face." By the time he reached the courtyard, he had decided against speeches, against letters, against strategy. He would take with him only a soaked coat, a stubborn heart, and the one sentence he had learned to earn in candlelight. I was wrong. The rest would have to be built where storms are believed, in Devon, under a roof that had learned the cost of staying up. He rode out as London woke to a story it thought it understood. Behind him, the forged letter, already fraying at its edges from being touched by so many clean gloves, began to unravel. A clerk at a printer's, dismissed without wages, brought a sample of the same paper to a rival editor. A dealer in jewels, offended belatedly by conscience, wrote to a trustee who owed him a favour and a daughter. Proof gathered itself like weather. None of it reached Nathaniel before the Moors did. He travelled into a sky that practised forgiveness in the only way weather knows, by beginning again. Ahead of him, Windermere gathered itself on its ridge like a question. He urged his horse and thought, for the first honest time, that love without courage is merely vanity with better handwriting. The weather in Devon does not apologize for accuracy. When Nathaniel reached the high road where moor and sea exchange insults, a storm rose with the precision of a witness taking the stand. Wind questioned his balance, rain cross-examined his resolve, the hedges hissed verdicts he could not quite hear. He rode into it the way a man rides into a story he deserves, hat low, jaw set, each mile a confession conducted in mud. Proof, meanwhile, had begun its quieter journey toward Clara. In London, a clerk with a grievance produced ledgers, an editor with a conscience produced ink, a jeweller with a daughter produced memory. The forged letter unstitched itself under daylight. The late Duke's real hand, spidery, vain, illiterate in its verbs, bore no resemblance to the elegant malice that had framed Clara. A trustee admitted the sale of jewels, the settlement of debts, the silence bought not by sin but by sacrifice. The city, startled by the sudden inconvenience of facts, prepared the only apology it knows, new invitations. They would arrive too late and in the wrong direction. Windermere stood on its ridge as if bracing for crosswinds and opinions. Nathaniel dismounted in a yard where rain rehearsed its entire vocabulary. The butler who answered his pounding knew him by reputation and hesitated only long enough to protect his mistress's right, not to be disturbed. "Your Grace," he said at last, and yielded a fraction. "Her Grace is in the west parlour." She was, of course. That room had been her harbour in all weather, fire-steady, table-plain, maps and ledgers arranged like other people's jewels. She stood by the hearth with one hand on the mantel and the other wrapped around nothing. Her hair had given up court manners for the practical art of staying out of her way. When Nathaniel entered, wet to the bone, and to his pride, she did not start. This was not a romance designed for fainting. He stopped 2 paces inside the door, as a man stops when distance is the last courtesy left. He bowed, no flourish, no defense. When he raised his head, rain still marked his lashes. "I was wrong," he said, voice low and even, as if speaking too loudly might break the floor. "I believed London at the hour I promised myself I never would." She held his gaze until the sentence settled. "They have begun to retract," she said. "Editors, patrons, old friends who discovered new scruples overnight. They bring me explanations like bouquets." "Do not collect mine," he said. "It is not flowers, it is failure." Something in her shoulders loosened. Not forgiveness yet, not anger either. Recognition. "You hesitated," she said simply. "I did," he answered. "I told myself duty had better handwriting than love. I told myself I could defend you better tomorrow if I remained silent today. It was cowardice with punctuation." He took a breath. "I have brought no speech and no defense. Only a question you owe me no answer to. Is there any work left here that I might join? Rafter? Ditch? Apology? I am prepared to earn the luxury of being near the woman I injured." Her eyes flicked to the window, where the storm pressed its face like a child. She moved to the table and picked up a folded paper. "The tenant at Lower Stoke has agreed to your ditch," she said, as if they had resumed a conversation mislaid in weather. "The orphan house's roof is half sound. St. Bride's waits for lime. The dairy wants a new pump." "Then I will carry lime," he said. "I will be a pump. I will be anything but an emptiness that once called itself a duke." She stared at him a moment longer. The parlour held the silence like a bowl. Then she set down the paper and crossed the room with the measured step of a woman who makes choices in complete sentences. She stopped within reach. "You hurt me," she said. And the words were neither accusation nor weapon. They were instruments. "Not by believing a lie, by letting it speak while you tried to bargain with decency." "Yes," he said. "You cannot mend that with a headline," she went on. "You cannot mend it with enemies either, only with practice." "Yes," he said again, and the repetition was not poverty now, but accuracy. Her hand lifted, slow, uncertain as a truce, and touched the band of rain-dark hair above his brow. It was not a caress. It was an examination. "Very well," she said softly. "Practice begins with listening." Her fingers fell. "Hear me." He stood straighter, as men do before orders they are grateful to receive. "I am not what they made me," she said. "But neither am I what you wanted me to be. When you stood across from me at Almack's and invented a courage for me that you had not yet earned for yourself. I am not a performance. I am a person who has paid for survival with unglamorous coin, ledgers, blankets, early mornings, late nights, and the sale of everything that once sparkled to save people who do not remember to say thank you. If you want me, you will want that. Not the scandal cleaned up and made decorative, not the miracle, the maintenance." His throat worked. "I do," he said, and there was no grandeur left in him to make the sentence pretty. "I want the maintenance. I want the algebra of roofs and the grammar of maps and the theology of soup. I will bring my boots and my name and place them under your command." A crack of thunder negotiated with the windows. She did not glance away. And when London turns again, as it will, because appetite is the only constant there, you will not hesitate? "I will not," he said. "You are certain?" she said, with the gravity of a contract read aloud. "I am frightened," he corrected, "and certain anyway." Something that had held her upright too long, pride, exhaustion, the dignity that keeps women from collapsing at the wrong time, relented by a degree. She exhaled. It sounded like a door unlocking somewhere one cannot see. "Then we begin," she said. "Not with the heart, with the roof. The heart will have to catch up." He smiled, crooked, relieved, and for a reckless instant reached as if to take her hand. He stopped himself. She saw the arrest and forgave the presumption because it had not been enacted. "Later," she said, and the word held more mercy than any embrace. They set to work. The storm did not abate, but it learned to share the afternoon. He read estimates, she argued with prices. He offered to endow the orphan house. She refused to let it be charity and made it partnership instead. He drafted a public statement and then tore it up when she raised an eyebrow. "Truth given to newspapers becomes entertainment," she said. "Truth done becomes custom." He wrote checks without flourish. She wrote lists without apology. Between them, the West Parlour gained a new weather, purpose. By evening, the storm had tired of eloquence. It carried its rhetoric out to sea and left behind a sky washed thin. Clara lit the lamps. Nathaniel stood at the window and watched moor and hedgerow admit they had survived another lecture. "Proof will reach you tomorrow," he said without turning. "Editors, trustees, clerks, they will arrive carrying absolution as if they had invented it." "I know," she said. "I have set aside 2 minutes to be amused." "And after?" he asked. "After," she said, "Windermere will hold a market for wages owed, and St. Bride's will receive lime, and the dairy will get its pump. And then, if we still have light, I will let you walk with me to the ridge. If I have forgiven you by then, you will know. If I have not, you will also know." He turned. "That is a kindness I do not deserve." "It is an accuracy you have earned," she replied. The butler brought supper, plain stew, righteous bread, a bottle of something that remembered being wine. They ate like conspirators who have burned their manifestos and kept only their work. When plates were cleared and the lamps lowered, she took a shawl and nodded toward the door. "Come," she said, "the ridge will not wait for proof." The world after a storm holds its breath in gratitude it cannot phrase. They stepped out into air that tasted newly minted. The path climbed between hedges, learning their sentences again. At the top, the sea lay like iron, softened by memory. The fields arranged themselves into arguments that no longer required shouting. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not yet touching, and watched day retrieve itself from cloud. Nathaniel spoke without rehearsal. "Clara," he said, voice hardly more than a working tool, "I cannot ask you for what I failed to protect. I can only place my name where it will do the smallest harm and the most good at your service. If there is a world in which you ask more of me later, I will be there. If there is not, I will still be there." Her hand lifted again, slower now, not to test, but to answer. She set her palm against his cheek, cool from the wind, rough with rains drying. It was not a lover's touch yet. It was a verdict. "Very well," she whispered. "We will try the small hours together. We will see if your courage keeps time." He closed his eyes, not in triumph, but in relief, the kind a man knows when the scaffolding holds. When he opened them, she had stepped half a pace closer, enough that their sleeves acknowledged each other as neighbours. Between them, the sea practised forgiveness in long, tireless breaths. They walked back without speaking. Words would have been decoration, and both of them were tired of ribbon. At the door she paused. "Tomorrow," she said, "bring your boots. The brook still misbehaves." "Yes," he said, and smiled as if the command had saved him. Inside, the West Parlour resumed its vigil. On the table lay the map where months ago he had drawn a second line, a path from door to chair. Tonight, another hand had added a third, almost invisible, a short, straight mark from chair to chair. London's proofs arrived at noon next day, fussy and late. They found the Duchess in her yard arguing amiably with a pump, and the Duke ankle-deep in a ditch, learning that penance sometimes looks like progress and sometimes like mud. The city might one day learn the difference. They had already begun. London's new season arrived with the vanity of a debut and the memory of an old scandal. The plane trees fluffed themselves as if applause could photosynthesize. Pall Mall rehearsed its clatter. The river wore its best indifferent blue. On the first Monday after Easter, when the city had agreed to forgive almost anything that made good conversation, Lady Clara Beaumont returned, not as inventory, not as entertainment, but as herself. Windermere House opened its shutters the way a chest opens after a long, clean breath. Lamps were polished, carpets shook off their regrets, and a scent of beeswax and new paint replaced the stale perfume of winter. Clara walked through rooms that had once conspired to make her feel curated, and found them honest now, hallways that carried voices without distorting them, mirrors that reflected a woman rather than a rumour. The morning brought what London calls contrition, baskets of flowers with notes pinned like alibis, cards from men who had preserved their reputations by misplacing their courage, invitations from hostesses who believed forgiveness improves seating arrangements. She read them with efficient attention and replied with accuracy. At noon, the carriage of the Duke of Evermere stopped before her door, and the city adjusted its collar. Nathaniel entered with a bow that had learned humility and kept its grace. "Your Grace," he said. "Your Grace," she answered, and the old form managed the new truth. They stood not quite close and not quite apart, the comfortable geometry of comrades who have done work together in bad weather. Their eyes held a conversation the footman pretended to miss. "Are we ready?" "As we'll ever be." They began with St. Bride's, rafters, now honest, ledger cleaner than the altar. Parish women greeted Clara as if she were an article of faith returned to stock. The vicar tried to make a speech and was rescued from himself by a loose button. They moved on to the orphan house where roof tile met sky in the correct order, and children displayed drawings in which a duke wore comically large boots and a duchess, improbably, a superhero cloak. Clara admired each, thanked each, and managed, with the precision of a statesman, to make every benefactor feel like an accomplice rather than a donor. Nathaniel said little. Pride, reformed, chastened, sat beside him and behaved. Evening called the city to its theatre, Lady Dalrymple's spring ball where chandeliers trembled like well-bred stars and violins forgave sins that had not yet been confessed. The staircase performed its favourite role. Clara entered wearing moonlit ivory with a whisper of lavender at the hem, the colour of storms when they decide to apologise. Her hair was pinned simply, pearls like a memory of snow. The room turned, then pretended it had not. Etiquette kept its seat only because it feared falling. She paused at the threshold. The pity that once preceded her like a minor herald was gone. In its place stood interest, then admiration, then something London is slow to admit: respect. Men who had mocked her discovered their wit had misplaced its blade. Women who had pitied her recognized in her carriage an answer to questions polite girls are not allowed to ask: what it costs to remain intact. Nathaniel crossed to her without haste, without nerves, only with the gravity of a man arriving exactly where he meant to be. He bowed, she accepted, and for a heartbeat the room practiced silence. "Shall we teach them arithmetic again?" he asked softly. "Let us be simple instead," she said. "One waltz, not as spectacle, as proof." He held out his hand. She placed hers in it, not the hand of petition, the hand of partnership, The orchestra entered that miraculous key where public music manages private truths. They stepped onto the floor, and London, very modern, very experienced, watched something it does not often see. Serenity danced. There was no fever to their movement, no exhibition. Her gown traced a slow figure 8 through light. His hand at her back occupied the exact measure of tenderness and no more. Their faces were not dramatic, they were at peace. If desire glowed there, it had learned to live without appetite's vocabulary. Around them, the quadrille faltered and recovered. A young lord counting beats forgot the number 8. A dowager lifted her fan and lowered it uselessly, as one does at a cathedral. On the second turn, a man stepped into their path with the cautious bravado of someone who has decided to be rehabilitated. The Duke of Fleet, debt now disguised as fashion, bowed to Clara with a smile he meant to sell as humility. "Your Grace," he murmured, "I have long wished—" Clara's answer was gentle and devastating. "To deserve me," she suggested. "Begin by deserving yourself." She inclined her head, not unkindly, and waltzed on. The room inhaled, then exhaled, and discovered that admiration can be quiet. Between figures, Nathaniel spoke without moving his lips. "I am unnecessary here." "Yes," she said, smiling, "and therefore of use. Stay." They finished to a hush that turned into applause because London cannot manage reverence for more than 3 seconds together. He led her from the floor to the edge of a mirror that had watched empires of fashion and survived them. Reflections multiplied. 2 people, 12, 100, all of them agreeing on one impossible thing. He looked not at the reflection, but at her. "This is the part," he said wryly, "where I am meant to make a statement designed to be overheard." "Try one designed to be believed," she returned. He bent, not to her hand, not to her ear, but to truth. "You make me brave." "And you make me quiet," she replied. "The good kind." The route the evening took after that belonged to logistics, congratulations, reintroductions, the rediscovery of friendships worth keeping, and the efficient retirement of those that were not. Nathaniel's mother approached with the air of a general suing for peace and offered Clara her arm. "You have improved my son's taste," she said. "For this, the nation thanks you." "The nation may thank the Moors," Clara said. "They knocked the vanity out of us." "Then send me a map," the Duchess returned dryly, and after a long pause, more articulate than a speech, she pressed Clara's hand once. It was not blessing, it was recognition. Later, in a smaller room where roses forgot to be symbolic and contented themselves with being fragrant, Clara stood at a window watching carriages flirt with the moonlight. Nathaniel joined her, the noise of the ballroom softened by distance. He did not speak first. In the month since Devon he had learned that silence is not a vacancy, but a discipline. "When they speak of you now," he said at last, "they say you are the measure." She shook her head. "They have found a new word because the old ones failed them. It will serve until it too requires mending." "Then let us spend it lightly," he said, "and earn it daily." She turned, and the look they shared had nothing to sell. "Tomorrow," she said matter-of-factly. "We return to the committee at 10, to the orphan house at noon, and to St. Bride's by 3. After that, if the city insists on celebrating, we may permit it an hour." "Generous," he said. "Strategic," she corrected. He reached for her hand and did not release it. "Clara," he said quietly, "I have made inquiries about the chapel near Windermere Ridge. It is sound in its bones, but wants new vows." "You are proposing logistics," she observed, happiness disguising itself as composure. "Always," he said. "Will you marry me, not to rescue, not to rehabilitate, but to continue the work, to spend and be spent, to mend and be mended, to be ordinary together until ordinary becomes holy. She did not make a scene, she had outgrown scenes. She nodded once, the way signatures are sometimes written by people who understand what paper is for. Yes. He kissed her then, briefly, gratefully, in the privacy of a window that had seen worse, and promised to see better. The kiss tasted of lemon ices gone warm and vows still drafting themselves. They parted before gratitude could become performance. Back in the ballroom, a final waltz called the city to order. They returned to the floor not as lesson but as life, two people moving in time with a music they did not own and did not need to. Around them, dukes adjusted their envy into politeness. Ladies adjusted their curiosity into admiration. Rumour, bored, turned its attention elsewhere. When the orchestra stopped, the chandeliers held their breath as if reluctant to let the scene end. Nathaniel bent toward her as applause flowered and faded. "They finally see what I always did," he murmured. Clara's smile was small and decisive. "No, Nathaniel," she said, voice steady as a hand on a plumb line. "They see what we have built. Let them keep the spectacle." She lifted their joined hands, not high, just true. "We will keep the work." And London, expert at mistaking theatre for truth, found itself, for one clean moment, corrected.